Or okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Group 6 and we would like to explain about the case studies. Before we go to the material, let me introduce the member of group. The first is me, Faisal Junior. The second is Nur Muhammad Ababil Kalasar. And last one is Muhammad Zaidan Dahsyat. Okay, next to the first material. What is a case studies? A case study is a specific instance that is frequently designed to illustrate a more generally principle. It is the study of an instant of in action. The single instant is of a bounded system, for example, a child, a clique, a class, a school, and a community. Case studies can establish cause and effect. Indeed, one of their strengths is that they observe effect in real context, recognizing the context is a powerful determinant of both cause and effects. Sturman argues that its distinguishing feature of case studies is that human systems have a wholeness or integrity to them rather than being a loose connection of threads necessitating in-depth investigation. Hitchcock and Hughes suggest that case studies are is distinguished less by the methodologies that they employ than by the subjects or objects of the inquiry. Case studies can make theoretical statements, but like other forms of research and human science, this must be supported by the evidence present. This requires of the nature of generalization in case study to be clarified. Generalization can take various forms, for example, from the single instance of the class of instance that it represents. For example, single-sex selective school might act as a case study to catch significant feature of other single-sex selective schools from features of the single case to a multiplicity of classes with the same features. From the single features of part of the case to the whole that case. There are several types of case study. Yin identifies three such types in terms of their outcomes: exploratory, descriptive, explanatory, exploratory. Case studies that act as a pilot can be used to generate hypotheses that are tested in large-scale surveys. Experiment or other form of research, observational, Yin's classification accords with evaluative. Merriam also categorizes four common domains or kind of case studies. The first is ethnographic, historical, psychological, and sociological. Sturman and Cohen-Stenhouse identifies four kind of case studies: an ethnographic case studies, single in-depth study, action research case study, evaluative case studies, and educational case studies. Stake identifies three main types of case studies. The first is intrinsic case studies, instrumental case studies, collective case studies. Charman and Stenhouse identifies four kinds of case studies: an ethnographic case studies, single in-depth studies, action research case studies, evaluating case studies, and educational case studies. Stake identifies three main types of case studies. The first is intrinsic case studies, instrumental case studies, collective case studies. The last one is a key issue. A key issue in case studies research is the selection of information. Though it is frequently useful to record typical representative occurrence, the researcher need not always adhere to criteria representativeness. For example, a subject might only demonstrate a particular behavior once, but it is so important as not to be ruled out simply because it occurred once. Sometimes a single event might occur which sheds a hugely important insight into a person's situation. It can be a key to understanding a situation. Case study is not having to seek a frequencies of occurrence can replace quantity with quality and intensity. Separating the significant view from the insignificant many instances of behavior. Again, the next material will be present by Muhammad Zaidan.
Okay, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. I'll continue this material and I'll explain about types of case studies. Type of case studies is unlike the experimenter who manipulates variables to determine their causal significance or the surveyor who asks standardized question of large representative samples of individuals. The case study researcher typically observes the characteristic of an individual unit, a child, a clique, a class, a school, or community. The purpose of such observation is to probe deeply and to analyze intensively the multifarious phenomena that constitute the life cycle of the unit with a view to establishing generalization about the wider population to which that unit belongs. Whatever the problem or the approach, at the heart of every case study lies of a method is observation. Okay. Next is you can see the tables in box 9.3. It sets out a typology of observational studies. You can read or watch this table, and you can read more to understand this table. Okay. Next. Okay. This is the description. In box 9.3, we identify a continuum of settings ranging from the artificial environment of the counselors and the therapists at the therapist clinic, cell 5 and cell 6, to the natural environment of school classroom, staff rooms, and playgrounds in cells 1 and cells 2. Because our continuum is truth and arbitrary, we are at liberty to locate studies of an information technology audit and computer usage, cells 3 and cells 4, somewhere between the article and the natural poles. Although, in theory, it's of the 6 example of case study in box 9.3 could have been undertaken either as a participant or as non-participant observation study. A number of factors intrude to make one or other of the observational strategies the dominant mode of inquiry in a particular type of setting. Bailey explained as follows. In a natural setting, it is difficult for researcher who wishes to be conferred not to act as a participant. If the researcher does not participate, there is little to explain his presence, as he is very obvious to the actual participants. Most studies in a natural setting are unstructured participant observation studies. Much the opposite is true in an artificial environment. Since there is no natural setting, in a sense of the persons being studied are really participants of long standing, and thus may accept a non-participant observer readily. Laboratory settings also enable non-participant observers to use sophisticated equipment such as videotape and tape recording. Thus, most studies in artificial laboratory settings will be structured and will be non-participant studies. What we are saying in that unstructured ethnographic account of teacher's work, cells 1, is the most typical method of observation in the natural surrounding of the school in which that study was conducted. Similarly, the structure inventories of the habits and personality employed in the study of Mr. Chong, Cell 6, reflect a common approach in the artificial setting of a counselor's office. Okay, the next material is why participant observation. The task of the educational investigator is very often to explain the means by which an orderly social world is established and maintained in terms of its sharing meanings. How do the participant observation technique assist the researcher in the task? According to Bailey, 1978, identifies some inherent advantage in the participant observation approach. The first is observation studies are superior to experiments and survey when data are being collected on nonverbal behavior. In observation studies, investigators are able to discern ongoing behavior as it occurs and is able to make appropriate notes about its salient features. Because case study observation takes place over an extended period of time, researchers can develop more intimate and informal relationships with those they are observing, generally in more natural environment than those in which experiments and surveys are conducted. The last is case study observation are less reactive than other types of data gathering methods. For example, in laboratory-based experiment and in survey that depend upon verbal response to structured questions. Bias can be introduced in the very data that researchers are attempting to study. Okay, that's all for me. The next material will be presenting by Nur Muhammad Ababil. Thank you.
Okay, the next material is recording observation. The recording of observation is a frequent source of concern to inexperienced case study researchers. How much of to be recorded? In what form should the recordings be made? What does one do with the mass of recorded data? Loveland gives a number of useful suggestions about collecting field notes. Next, the first is record the notes as quickly as possible after observation. Since the quantity of information forgotten is varies like over a short period of time, but accelerates quickly as more time passes. Next is discipline yourself to write notes quickly and reconcile yourself to the fact that although it may seem ironic, recording of field notes can be expected to take as long as is spent in actual observation. Next is dictating rather than writing is acceptable if one can afford it, but writing has the advantage of stimulating thought. Next is typing field notes is firstly preferable to handwriting because it is faster and easier to read, especially when making multiple copies. Next is it is advisable to make at least two copies of field notes and preferable to type on a master for production. One original copy is retained for references and other copies can be used as rough draft to be cut up, re- reorganized and rewritten. And the, the last is the notes have to be full enough adequately to summon up for one again. Months later, a reasonably vivid picture of any described event. This probably means that one ought to be writing up, at the very minimum, at least a couple of single space type pages for every hour of observation. The the sort of note taking recommended by Loveland and actually undertaken by King and Walcott in their ethnography accounts grows out of the nature of the unstructured observation study. Until your observation and impression from one visit are a matter of record, there is little point in returning to the classroom or school and reducing the impact of one set of events by superimposing another and more recent set. Indeed, when the record one's data is but one of a number of practical problems identified by Walker, which are listed in box 9.4. Next, next page, next slide. The next is planning a case study. In planning a case study, there are several issues that researchers may find useful to consider. The first point is the particular circumstance of the case, including the possible disruption to individual participant that participation might entail, uh, and negotiating access to people, negotiating ownership of the data, negotiating release of the data. Next is the conduct of the study, including the use of primary and secondary sources, the opportunities to the check data, triangulation, respondent validation, and reflectivity, the data collection method in the interpretive paradigm. Case studies tend to use certain data collection method, semi-structured and open interviews, observation, narrative accounts and documents, diaries, maybe also tests rather than other methods. The next is the consequence of the research. This might include the anonymizing of the research in order to protect participants. Though such anonymization might suggest that a primary goal of case study is generalization rather than the portrayal of a unique case, it might go against a central feature of case study. Next slide. Nisbet and Watt suggest three main stages in undertaking a case study. Because case studies catch the dynamics of unfolding situation, it is advisable to commence with a very wide field of focus, an open face without selectivity or prejudgment. Stillman places on a set of continua the nature of data collection, types, and analysis technique in case studies researchers. These are presented in summary form, in that form, data collection. Okay, that's all from me. Thank you.
Okay, that's all from our group. If you have any comment or if you have any question, just write down in the comment box. And thank you very much for the attention. Thank you very much for watching our video. And the last I say, wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. See you. Have a nice day.